Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. I'm Armin Georgian in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Well, today I'm very pleased to welcome the Vice President of the European Parliament, Mairead McGuinness, who has served in this role since January 2017, although she was first elected to this chamber in 2004 on the Fine Gael ticket. That party is now the governing party in Ireland. Welcome to you. Thank you for being my guest.
You're in Strasbourg.
Thank you. I am too. Let's take a quick look at the latest developments on Brexit, and then I'll get your reactions, and particularly on Prime Minister Boris Johnson's tactics or style, call it what you will. The empty lectern, that famous moment with him and the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Let's take a look.
Booing protesters greeted Boris Johnson as he came out of his meeting with Luxembourg's Prime Minister. In a stark demonstration of just how far apart the EU and the UK remain, the British Prime Minister skipped a joint press conference, leaving his counterpart alone on the podium.
I wanted to thank Mr. Johnson, who was here today.
Bettel pulled no punches over Johnson's failure to deliver an alternative Brexit deal, accusing him of politicking.
You can't hold a future hostage for party political gains.
The meeting with Bettel followed Johnson's first face-to-face talks with the European Commission's outgoing president, Jean-Claude Juncker. The EU issued a statement saying the bloc remained open to alternatives, but only if an insurance policy like the Irish backstop was in place.
President Juncker recalled that it is the UK's responsibility to come forward with legally operational solutions that are compatible with the withdrawal agreement. Such proposals have not yet been made.
Johnson, however, stressed progress was being made and that he would not budge on that sticking point.
Yes, there is a good chance of a deal. Yes, I can see the shape of it. But it will require movement, and it will require the system by which the EU can control the UK after we leave, the so-called backstop, to go from that treaty.
The British Parliament has passed a law requiring the Prime Minister to ask for an extension to Brexit if no new deal is struck by the 19th of October. The EU is ruling out giving yet another extension just to buy time.
What's your sense of where this Brexit crisis is going?
Well, I suppose we all look at those visuals and get anxious. As you know, the British Prime Minister was in Ireland the previous week and did have a joint press conference. I mean, I suppose when I look back that this is 2016 and we're now at the end almost of 2019, I wonder how we've got to this place and made very little progress. My sense of what's happening now is that we are now on the third British Prime Minister around a Brexit scenario, that this Prime Minister is very forthright in saying he will leave the European Union, do or die, or indeed do and die, on October the 31st, and that he also wants a deal. So I suppose the optimistic politician part of me says that he really does want a deal and is working towards that. When I hear the other side of the rhetoric that we will leave and take back control on that date, I am a little bit troubled by it. On the other hand, I'm a parliamentarian. I watched the House of Commons. I've watched that Parliament vote against a no-deal option, and therefore the law strictly states that the British Prime Minister must come and request an extension if that's needed.
Do you think that extension would be given even if there's no general election being planned? Because then there's no reason really to give an extension, is there?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of members here and around Europe would like to know the reason for an extension. But I also believe that this Parliament would support an extension because we do not want to be seen to be the difficult partner in a troubled relationship. And in fact, we've stood together well and we have maintained good relationships with the United Kingdom through very difficult moments. So I think there's nothing in it for either party, either the UK not to look for an extension or indeed for Europe to reject it. But we would want to see it in the context of perhaps an election. I think that's inevitable in the United Kingdom. And I suppose to just build on that, my concern about then timelines, let us presume that there is an extension granted. I would wonder, is January next year, the end of that, long enough? Because if we have an election in the interim between the October and January, will things have settled down sufficiently? So I don't want to predict this, but I don't want to see a rolling 3-month extension, but we may need to look wisely, or indeed the Council will need to look wisely at a request request and indeed the time span.
We'll see if heads of government share your view on this. But in terms of the actual possible deal, the Irish foreign minister said at the beginning of this month, if there's no deal, we will aim to put up checks away from the border. Boris Johnson is talking about checks away from the border. Is there really no room, no space for an agreement given those two statements?
Well, I think we have to look at how long it took us to get to the place where the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, came to, because Europe looked and suggested a Northern Ireland only backstop, and that would have solved a lot of problems. However, for political reasons, the British Prime Minister then suggested widening that out to a UK-wide backstop. Europe agreed to that. My worry is that how can something be found to replace that, which took a long number of months and indeed years to come to. And when you ask me, is there room somewhere in there? I think what's interesting is that the British Prime Minister has suggested movement on the agri-food side in line with his, I think, growing understanding of the need for a backstop. He hasn't gone the full road on that, but perhaps with these meetings, which I think will step up, he may come to a wider conclusion of the need for a more robust backstop. And
so you sense he's heading towards the original idea, which is a Northern Ireland only backstop. Northern Ireland stays in EU regulations.
Well,
is that where do you think he's going there?
I'm smiling because I don't think you or I can predict what Boris Johnson is thinking. And I think even those around him may not know, because we also have a Conservative Party conference coming up at the end of this month. And that, of course, I think nothing can happen before that politically.
But that's the logical conclusion. If the checks away from the border can't be made legally operational, surely the only two options then left are either a Northern Ireland only backstop or no deal. And
or the UK-wide backstop.
Or the UK-wide, which he's ruled out.
Yeah, but there's another tricky part of all of this. The House of Commons has rejected that on 3 occasions, I think. So my worry is that we will have a coalition of MPs who will want to remain, voting with those who want to leave with no deal, rejecting an agreement. So I think the politics in the House of Commons will need to evolve towards understanding that the best option for all of us is an orderly Brexit. And we haven't had that level of engagement thus far. If you listen to the debate in the European Parliament this week, which I was happy to chair part of it, the Brexiteers, I think they're called the Brexit Party, they cheered when anyone mentioned no deal. Their objective is not to reach an orderly Brexit. And remember that Boris Johnson is feeding that part of his constituency because he wants to, I suppose, take back control from the Brexit Party, although he may find himself being sucked, in other words, the Conservative Party becoming more of the Brexit Party. So difficult UK politics. I
want to ask you about Irish preparations for no deal. Of course, you worked on agricultural issues a lot as a journalist. How prepared is the farming sector on the Republic of Ireland side of the border? Will there be compensation if there are huge losses due to World Trade Organization tariffs and so forth?
I think there's lots of preparations going on both in the agri-food sector and in other parts of the Irish services and manufacturing side. We already have a crisis in Ireland on the beef sector. I dare say your farmers are also feeling it. The impact of Brexit has happened because buyers in the UK with this rolling date of a Brexit have not been buying forward. And we have a very unusual situation in Ireland where our farmers are protesting outside meat plants and there's a blockade. So in a sense, we have already seen an impact. And yes, there is a consideration, there's a package from Europe and the Irish government to support that sector, but it will not be enough. And I think the debate in our parliament was very strongly saying that those sectors and countries that will be directly impacted need to have some support, in fact significant support, not just from their national governments, but from the European Union. Because, for example, if Ireland's beef exports to the United Kingdom are dramatically impacted, where will that beef go? Probably to France and Germany and elsewhere, and have a negative impact. So in a sense, an Irish problem becomes a European problem. And I think my colleagues here in the Parliament, in the Agriculture Committee where I serve, understand that very well. But what I have noticed in the 3 years of this trauma is that more and more my constituents, my businesses are getting quite fatigued by the anxiety that they've lived with and are wondering how prepared they can ever be, because they hope that there will be a deal, and they're thinking then, how do we prepare for a no deal? Because that is quite an Armageddon. Yeah. It's quite critical.
And speaking of uncertainty, of course, there's been a lot of concern about the peace process. But actually, if you look at all the various positions, nobody's going to physically put up infrastructure, are they? I mean, the Irish government said it won't do that. The UK won't put it up. The European Commission isn't going to send in people with, hats and whatever. Yeah. So no one's actually going to put up a border.
Yeah, but let's look at the reality of this. If there's a no deal and there is this crash out and relationships are very strained afterwards, the European Union rightly will want to protect the single market, and Ireland will want that the single market is protected at the same time, knowing that infrastructure or any other barriers, either physical or otherwise, will impact on the all-Ireland economy, which goes against the Good Friday Agreement. And what I bitterly regret, and with great sadness I say this, that during the referendum, or indeed before David Cameron called it, there was no consideration of what would happen to the island of Ireland. Nobody thought about the realities that the UK leaving would drag Northern Ireland with it and all of the consequences that flow from it. And if this had been a simple divorce, and divorce never is simple, we wouldn't be here 3 years down the road discussing how difficult and how complicated it is.
But just to come back to this lack of an actual hard border, as everyone said, they're not going to put it up. I don't see why we should jump from saying that perhaps if dissident Republicans shoot a few extra security cameras, that then brings the Troubles back. I mean, that's a very huge leap, it seems to me.
I've never said that we would bring the Troubles back, and I think we should be very cautious around that. But I'm from County Louth, which is a border county. I represent all of the counties along that border. I'm old enough, sadly, to have seen the horrors and to have listened to the reports, and my children never experienced that, and that's a really important message. I do know from my contacts on the ground that there are strained relationships between the communities that had been slowly forgetting if you like, that I'm on this side and you're on that side, and we're getting on with life. And you'd have to say that there are strained relationships in this Parliament between people who had, in the past and before Brexit, had a good relationship. So the biggest worry now is, even if Boris Johnson does pull the UK out with no deal, we will have to start talking again. And he must understand that if you slam the door on someone, it's harder to knock and ask to come back in again. So we are in a very difficult political space where political relationships are damaged, and we have to be mindful of that.
Let's move on to some other issues, because we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately. The European Parliament is soon auditioning the nominees for the next top jobs in the European Commission. It's been pointed out that 6 of the commissioners have attracted some form of controversy to do with financial dealings, for example. That doesn't send a very strong signal to Europeans, does it, that these picks have been made, given the controversy that
I think it's worth remembering how this happens. So member states propose candidates. I think President-elect von der Leyen has been very clear and very effective. She has a gender-balanced commission. She also has looked at regions to make sure they're well represented. In my experience in the Parliament, there have always been some controversy around individual commissioners.
But not as many as this. Well, 6 out of 20.
Yeah, but I think you are jumping quite a hoop to suggest that there will be a problem for those 6. This is a house where people talk, so there's a lot of conversation around some. Whether it goes to hearing and when people listen to what the commissioners have to say and are then either accepted or rejected, none of us can predict.
Sure, but is your sense from the talk in the corridors and so forth that, how many of these commissioners do you think are going to get through and not?
I think if the 6, that figure you suggest, I think that would be excessive. I would be very surprised if it is that. But in my memory, there have always been 1 or 2 where there have been questions that have arisen on the nomination. Sometimes commissioners come to the hearings and are very strong and are very clear and, if you like, remove the doubt. There's also the politics. This is a house of politics. So political groups, I think, will also look at candidates. And, there is always this idea that, be very careful who you are difficult with, because everybody will want to support the candidates coming from their political groups.
But the perception of wrongdoing, even if it's not necessarily proven in court at this stage, there are some political cultures in which that would be grounds for somebody to withdraw their candidacy.
Indeed, and I think
and you
that's
don't think
true.
that should apply here?
Well, I've tried to look at all of the detail. I haven't gone through each commissioner as forensically as I will by the time the hearings come. And it may well be that individuals might decide not to face, if you like, a very tough hearing. I haven't got that message yet. So even around those individuals where there are questions being raised, I haven't heard that they're, if you like, shying from coming forward to the hearing.
I wonder if you think Ursula von der Leyen has made a gaffe already. There's been a lot of chatter in this Assembly about the portfolio about protecting the European way of life, which some people said was a dog whistle to the far right. Has she made a big mistake already at this very early stage in her career?
I've listened to her explain very clearly what that was about, because I'd heard all of the media, if you like, frenzy around that term, because it is quite nebulous and anyone can interpret it in different ways. She referred us to Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, which you should, look at, and it's very clear about the values of Europe. So in other words, it does depend on how you want to read something. Some group, I think there's one group that are particularly concerned about that. But if you look at the detail of the portfolios that she has allocated to individual commissioners, I think she's been forensically clear about what she expects from them.
Do you think that particular portfolio will be ejected, it will be thrown out?
I don't think so, but I've been wrong before, so hold me to account if I am. For my side, I wish people would see the good in things and not the bad, and I think there's been a sense in which let's find the negatives. And I actually think it is true of it. Well, I mean, I come from that profession myself, so I understand it very well. I think we have a lot of work to do on migration, on climate change, on Brexit, and I think the worst we could do as political groups and individuals is fight each other rather than work better together. And I suppose I'm from a small country, and I'm afraid we know how to work together because we're small in numbers, so we have to work stronger together.
Thank you so much. We'll have to end it there. Thank you to Mairead McGuinness, my guest today on Talking Europe. And do join us in just a few minutes, because the second half of this programme is coming up after this short break.
French wine is arguably one of the best things about France.
And some say it's the best in the world, although that's debatable. But one thing's for sure is that wine is an art form in France. It's an integral part of our culture and a thriving industry.
But just why does French wine have such a great reputation? What's the trick to getting a really good bottle? And what are the latest trends?
Join us for this episode of French Connections Plus, where we savor the wonderful world of French wine.
French Connections Plus, presented by Jeannie Godula and Florence Villeneuve.